Hello and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, airlines in crisis as the spread of the coronavirus hits air travel demand and prompts carriers into their own outbreak of capacity cuts and profit warnings amid the threat of more airline failures. And a year on from the grounding of the MAX, we look at the continuing challenges facing Boeing to get the type back in service. My name's Graham Dunn, and I'm joined by my airline business colleague Lewis Harper.
Hi Graham, how are you?
Yes, it's definitely been an interesting few weeks, a busy old time for us, as for the industry, and even when we were thinking and sort of plotting out the theme of the podcast and what we'd be talking about a few days ago, it's already very, very different. It
is. We're seeing it's a story. If you're trying to track all the individual airline announcements we're getting on routes being cut or frequencies being reduced or aircraft being grounded, it's kind of that's a full-time job on its own. And doing that, it's hard to get really a grasp of the full picture, isn't it? Even it's almost easier to stand back sometimes and kind of consider it as a whole. And I think important to do that as well.
And I think from the big change of the last few weeks or so has really been the coronavirus, the impact of which I think everyone was probably prepared that it would be. There was plenty of talk of this is going to expand outside of China, but it really has expanded out, and in particular, all regions are impacted, but we're seeing it very heavily in Europe now.
We are so in Europe we've got obviously Italy has become the centre of the biggest outbreak outside China now, I think. So and the Italian market again, there's some ambiguity. So overnight we've heard that the kind of quarantine, as it were, that's been applied into northern Italy is now applied to the whole country. But there's some ambiguity around what that means for air connectivity. So I think flights are still operating.
Well, it's difficult. I mean, if, for example, you're going on holiday to Italy early April, 2 days after the outbreak, you're not quite sure.
Yeah, and
if anyone happens to be doing that.
Yeah, it's different. And I was looking, Eamon Brennan of Eurocontrol put out some figures on Twitter. I see that. So yesterday, which is when we're recording, is the 9th of March. That some Italian air movements around Italy were down 35% year on year on the 9th of March. So a huge impact there. But even that, it's difficult to imagine there's even that level of connectivity happening with what's going on there. And when you look at, you imagine what the demand for travel must be actually rock bottom there, really. And as we know, the Italian market is kind of a big area for the low-cost carriers particularly, so it'd be interesting to see looking at their traffic figures, I guess, when we get them for this month.
Yeah, and I think, and this morning we had Air France KLM put out its traffic figures. They were, from a European perspective, they're an interesting one to watch because a few days ago we had Ryanair and Wizz Air's figures out, and this is traffic data for February, and it was a bit odd because you had Ryanair traffic ups however many percent and Wizz up 9-10%, but that's because they're growing carriers and it was Europe and the cuts were only beginning to impact in February. Air France KLM is the first sort of the major European carriers, the big groups, they've had to suspend half a dozen destinations they were serving in China from pretty much the end of January. So you start to see it, and passenger traffic was down 25% on Asia routes. That was the capacity cut, something like 15%. So, it's a 10-point drop in load factor. You're starting to also see short-haul traffic across Air France KLM. That was down, only by 1%, something like that. But again, more so than capacity. And I think that started to give indications of the scale, and that's at a stage even before we've seen the cancellations, which have now spread out across March.
That's it. So again, look at those Eurocontrol figures. So overall in European airspace, movements were down 10% on the 9th of March. I think you're right. Even then, you're looking and wondering whether the load factors will be down on the flights that are actually operating. So it's a far kind of bigger impact, I think, that we'll only really get a full grasp of it, I think, when we start getting figures through, as you say, for March, where I think we're looking, obviously, Italy has got a particularly difficult situation. We're looking at kind of projections of the UK, where we are obviously heading towards possibly a similar path where cases are kind of growing pretty fast now. So yeah, and all this, I guess, where this is coming from, a key thing would be corporate travel is way down. A lot of companies, for a myriad reasons, really, don't want their staff travelling. So and that has a big impact on across the board. Really, it's not a lot of companies will be using low cost carriers as well, but also generally the appetite for travel is pretty low. We've seen what comes with that at the moment for a lot of people will be having to self-isolate if they've been to an area that, even if they're travelling to there now, when it's relatively clear in a particular country, they don't know what's going to happen. And leisure markets, I guess, are another one where we've seen people stuck in a hotel in Tenerife for weeks, for example. That the appetite for travel is pretty low. What's unclear at the moment really is how much more this will spread. So we're obviously based in Europe, so we can see that. So the next couple of weeks, I think, is going to be key to that. Whether we're looking at more countries ending up in an Italy type situation, or whether the situation will get better. And obviously, talking about the situation getting better, obviously in China the number of new cases has been falling, and so there is evidence that this could be turned around. Obviously, this is kind of unprecedented, I guess, in terms of its impact, so beyond SARS and everything. So it's difficult to imagine. Maybe there might be a more medium-term impact on appetite for travel. Who knows? But it's very, very tough environment.
And I think one of the additional challenges for carriers, these are challenges that the Asian carriers have been facing, especially the Chinese operators, right from the start, where all their markets are impacted. I think what you're seeing when it spreads to the other regions, so within short-haul European travel, so when it's affecting long-haul markets, there's the aircraft that are suspended on long-haul routes to Asia, but actually to some extent there was still an opportunity that they could maybe redeploy some of that capacity to the US network, or networks that weren't impacted, potentially reuse some of that capacity. Obviously with short-haul aircraft, once the markets in Europe have gone, there isn't really anywhere else to put them, because even if it's Italy, which is obviously taking the prime brunt of the capacity cuts, demand elsewhere isn't fantastic, and is going to also be hit.
Yeah, exactly. There's nowhere, that stands out as being kind of a safe zone at the moment. So you're absolutely right. And obviously in the US, we've seen the Trump administration kind of playing down the whole virus, but very quickly that situation appears to be changing. So on transatlantic now, that's clearly going to have an impact. And at an individual airline level, you see across the board, we've seen Korean have just said that they've had an 80% cut of their international capacity. Obviously, Korea's been particularly badly hit. So 100 of their 145 passenger aircraft are currently grounded. Everywhere you look, Hawaiian, which relies on that Asian market coming in, tourism, has said it's particularly bad. And I guess Cathay Pacific is probably one of the most stark examples of this, where they're grounding dozens and dozens of aircraft. They've got it from all sides. Really, they're already in a difficult position because of the protests in Hong Kong, and it's quite a mess at the moment. Trying to find a clear view, I think, is going to take a while.
And I think one of the other aspects is how the airline industry has changed now from something like SARS. It's a bigger industry. You have, particularly the Asian market, it's built out an awful lot, so they're and China. But you also have an industry which I think has become more conscious of keeping capacity in the right place. So they've been much more cautious. We've seen it already. Passenger traffic had already dropped last year. Not dropped, but the great growth had slowed. Yeah. And a lot of that was around airlines, especially in Europe, thinking, we want to keep disruption to a minimum during challenges over the summer. What's happening with demand? Bit of unknown elements to that. So you already see this more cautious approach, and I think actually airlines in Europe have acted. It's a difficult message to tread, because on the one hand they still want to encourage people to come and fly, and so tell people they are accepting bookings and they are flying. But at the same time, they're trying to tell their investors, they're trying to make shareholders clear that they are keeping capacity in trim. And I guess the other thing, and you've seen it a lot here in the UK, is messaging around this idea of ghost flights, which has there's a whole environmental impact, which is What people don't want to see is airlines flying empty flights just to keep slots going.
No, that's it. So yeah, you're right. It's a blessing in many ways that a lot of the industry, as you said, moved away from that kind of double-digit growth kind of a trend that we'd seen, particularly around the peak years in 2017 and things. So it's helpful that airlines are in that kind of retrenchment sort of mode to an extent. Anyway, we weren't obviously talking about capacity going down, but it certainly was moderating that growth. Although in some individual airline cases, Norwegian being an example, it was actually a reduction in capacity. On that point as well, I guess the grounding of the MAX has turned out again, there's a bit of a blessing that maybe that hasn't come back as quickly as maybe some might have thought. So we're not, if the MAX was suddenly back, so you're adding 400 aircraft into the mix in this environment, those are just the ones that were in service when the grounding happened. That clearly would be unhelpful, and I'd imagine a lot of them would remain grounded. On that side of things, I guess the industry kind of was in some cases in a mindset, but I think still we're obviously the impact of this is pretty significant beyond that really, and it's as we say, it's that plenty of airlines are saying this could become extremely problematic. So Korean Air, as I go back to them, they're saying it is a threat to their survival, that if this carries on as things are at the moment. So, and it's not alone in that as well.
Absolutely. So we're going to look at the financial impact for airlines, and in fact the impact on the sustainability of airlines, which has come under even closer scrutiny in recent days, in part 2. For all the latest on how airlines are responding to the coronavirus, visit FlightGlobal.com, and don't forget to register to get all our best analysis, interviews and opinion. Welcome back. So before the break we were talking about the financial impact on airlines of coronavirus, and IATA is the Global Airline Association. They've been having a go at trying to quantify that, and that's not an easy task.
It's not. So earlier in February they put out an initial estimate that said that the impact on revenues for airlines would be around just below $30 billion over the year. I'll put that in context in a minute, but but obviously, in an indication of how quickly this situation has progressed, it was within a couple of weeks they're putting out a new set of numbers that are much more significant than that. So they kind of basically put out 2 scenarios looking at a limited outbreak. I'm not sure exactly where we cross into the 2 different scenarios, yes. but certainly a limited outbreak they suggested would have are now saying would have a $63 billion impact on global airline revenues, which they say equates to around 11%, so 11% reduction in what they had projected for the whole year. In an extended outbreak covering a much wider area, they were looking at an impact of around $113 billion on global revenues in 2020, which was around 19%, and they said this is in line with kind of the global financial crisis. From that point of view, yes, those numbers I guess are still open for revision as well themselves. I guess there may be a point where that limited scenario, for example, is no longer relevant. And when you look at some of the numbers that are coming out from airlines in terms of capacity levels cut and things like that, it's you kind of start to not doubt those numbers, but see how they could get much worse as if this doesn't peak in the next couple of months.
Absolutely, and where you see airlines, and that IATA had already centred its initial, where most of the challenges were going to be was obviously in the Asian market. That would be where the revenues were hardest hit there. And I suppose it's that mix. So for some carriers, you're seeing, a lot of exposure and, large numbers of whole networks kind of essentially wiped out. Whole market's gone. And then for other regions, Latin America, whatever, it's relatively unscathed. So I suppose once it all balances out, but it's certainly when you see the kind of levels of capacity that airlines are taking out of the market, the Korean we talked about before, Qantas, I think, just announced A380s has been taken out of service for 6 months. This is a big chunk of capacity, so you can start to see why the impact is so large. I suppose the one area, of course, is it doesn't necessarily collate with 120 or 115 off the bottom line, because simply by not cutting capacity, there's airlines can, or by cutting capacity, airlines can limit the impact of this. They're obviously implementing a series of measures, whether that is, you've seen various carriers looking at perhaps temporary layoffs or, recruitment freezes and so forth. And then from a cost side, there is a sort of bizarre upside, I guess, through oil.
Yeah, so fuel prices are extremely low at the moment, and if you look, obviously fuel is a huge proportion of airline costs, so it's not insignificant that because demand for oil is so low, globally, and not just restricted to the airline industry, just because of a general economic slowdown, we're looking at fuel at rock bottom prices, with the caveat that if you're hedged at a much higher price, then that doesn't apply. So
it takes a while for it to
filter through. So for a lot of carriers, while there'll be a myriad kind of negative impacts of this, there is this and not insignificant, as I say, helpful factor in low fuel. I think an important bit of context as well is that for a lot of airlines, the summer season, Northern Hemisphere summer season, as we're heading into, is really critical. We've seen in Europe, for example, a lot of carriers fall over going into the winter because the summer hasn't been strong enough to give them that kind of push through the difficult winter months. So absolutely crucial summer season, particularly in leisure markets, clearly is it's really it's going to make or break whether this extends. If it starts to extend towards June, July.
You're absolutely right in terms in terms of revenues, in terms of the fullness of capacity, in terms of yields. 25% of Ryanair's season in July or August compared to 25% Ryanair's season in March. They're different levels in terms of the revenue you're bringing in. So there's a definite, as you said, the longer it goes on, and they're I guess that is the big cut. At the moment, you're seeing airlines are largely cutting capacity through to the start of early April, to mainland China, perhaps through to the end of April. The next stage, I'm sure there'll be further capacity cuts beyond that. But I guess it's when you start seeing that kicking into those peak summer months, June, July, August, and so forth. Then you really know the scope and extent of the troubles. Yeah,
and there's clearly going to be a pent-up demand for air travel. So if as it seems maybe unlikely at the moment, but if in a couple of months things are looking a lot better, then there could be a sudden boost, in the summer months will be relatively strong. But yeah, it's you only have to look at airline share prices, kind of down 25% and more, kind of across the board, to know that a lot of people are seeing this as a extremely serious situation, and in some cases it has kind of had the ultimate impact. So.
Now, one of the things that IATA and that airlines are seeking going into that summer season, even now, is some respite to the slot rules, which kind of govern what they can fly. And we've already seen that a little bit around those affected areas where flights aren't allowed at all. Or under government advice. So China is a sort of a good example where slot rules around that have been relaxed, but there's sort of a wider call for that to be suspended over the summer, isn't it?
Yeah, so we have the 80-20 rule, for example, where if you don't use your slot 80% of your slots, then it's open for someone else to you lose the right to them, essentially. So there's a logical call for that to be relaxed, and yeah, it's fairly clear there won't be that many airlines kind of queuing up to take on the extra slots at the moment anyway. So I guess there's it seems logical, but obviously there's a lot of politics around that and issues to
yeah, and that sort of plays into this other wider issue around to what level the state should be stepping in for airlines, and we saw that in real detail and coming to the fore with the collapse of UK regional Flybe.
This is it. So there's a kind of the juxtaposition at the moment is, the governments want airlines, connectivity is brilliant for the economy, and all of that. But on the other side, there's the environment, as we've talked about in a lot of podcasts, has become this really shot up the agenda, particularly in Europe in the last 12 months, where people are asking much more fundamental questions about whether they should be flying as much, and also and it plays into that whether governments should be keeping airlines afloat when they are pretty big contributors to CO2 emissions and projected to get more significant in terms of the global total, but simply because they don't have any easy answers to those CO2 emissions. So it's a difficult situation. We've seen obviously Flybe, as you touched on, have collapsed after seeming to get a reprieve about a month or so ago. In this case, it's difficult to judge whether this was a busted kind of business model. So as ever with an airline collapse, it's tough to kind of cite one factor, but clearly one of the things Flybe was asking for in order to keep operating was a reduction in the air passenger duty, which is levied with the environment very much in mind. And the challenge for all governments now is that, yes, IATA itself has said that government should, during this period, certainly should consider making lives easier for airlines by maybe temporarily cutting taxes or duty, but the tough challenge for the governments is they know that if they do that, then it's difficult to row back, and at the same time they've got pretty tough targets around the Paris Agreement, for example. We've seen with the recent court ruling that Heathrow's third runway was illegal or unlawful because it did not, the planning didn't take into account the Paris goals for emissions. So it's a difficult one, and in some cases it's easier. In other markets, in Asia, for example, I say easier, but certainly the governments are much more able to inject infinite cash into an airline to keep it going. But you look to Europe, for example, where they're much more stringent state aid rules for any business. The way that governments could help airlines is around that reduction in taxes, for example. But there's going to be a very vocal lobby that won't want them to do that. So the balance it's impossible to judge at the moment. Really.
And it is fascinating. I happened to be in Belfast at the weekend, which was one of the more impacted airports. Not only do you see Flybe aircraft on the ground, you see lots of people who are really concerned about that loss of connectivity, and who's going to replace it. So it is very difficult. I think your point. I mean, the Virgin Connect consortium it's one of the factors it did mention about Flybe was that the coronavirus had also had an impact in terms of faltering demand as it was trying to get through these. I think that probably made the crisis more urgent. But as a model, it's really difficult. I think regional carriers in particular have a challenge because it's a bit more of a fluid market. They will make an investment on a particular, whether to go for turboprops or jets, depending on what which they think, and fuel price is a massive factor on that, and that can make some routes really profitable, and then suddenly they're not. And also there's and it comes into context. Flybe, which was had a lot of profit, rarely recorded a profit over the last decade in what is the most profitable period for airlines historically, and that sort of shows the challenge. And Flybe was heavily hit by, was squeezed by low-cost carriers coming in, and they ended up slightly nomadic because as a regional carrier in the UK, that's pretty much, if you're a low-cost carrier, you can go and you've got a problem in Italy, you'll see carriers turning to other markets in Europe. Ryanair will look to other parts where they could put capacity or look to increase, cover the revenues and the yields. If you're Flybe and you're struggling in that market, there's not many other places you can go if you're a UK regional carrier.
No, and on that exposure to a single market. In Flybe's case, of course, as well, they were impacted by, after the Brexit vote, the value of the pound kind of fell through the floor, and with a lot of their expenses in other currencies, that made it particularly difficult for them as well, and their cash situation was pretty dire, and had been obviously for a longer term, but certainly that wasn't helped either by that. So you're right, when you're focused on the small market, and this is where I think a lot of the vulnerabilities are if this situation carries on with the virus. I think in the next 2 or 3 months we may see certainly the smaller carriers struggling to stay afloat. Is that vulnerability to a single market where you can't just say, well, actually we can move those 10 A320s to another base in Austria, for example, in EasyJet's case,
absolutely. The irony is that another carrier that would have had that problem, Air Italy, which was largely Milan-based, was already forced to take the decision to cease operations even before the challenges in Italy came around.
That's it. I think it's probably reasonable to say if they hadn't made that decision then, that their situation now would have been pretty dire. I think with Air Italy, obviously it had Qatar Airways as a 49% owner of what used to be Meridiana. There's a whole complicated history about Meridiana owning the Air Italy name from... You're an expert on this. You could write all day on this, couldn't you? In fact, have you got a book coming out?
I think so. I think that should be. The Italian market has been consolidated, and these smaller. And by the time Air Italy ended up as a relatively small carrier, and when you look at the Italian market, Ryanair is the biggest carrier in there because of these constant failings that the carriers had. Qatar had an attempt to kind of provide. There's a very tempting market. Lots of airlines have had a go. Lots of foreign airlines have been attracted to trying to build a partner in there because it's such an attractive market. And Italian carrier, the prime Italian carrier, Alitalia, seems so very weak, and so it feels like a market. The time didn't work for Qatar. I think there was some more challenges around the long-term stakeholder in there, through Al-Asada, which had carried losses for a long period of time. I guess with Italy, the other then issue is now you're looking at a lockdown, really troubled country through coronavirus, and it already has quite a troubled carrier in Alitalia.
Yeah, and we've already seen because of Alitalia's troubles, they've kind of plateaued really in terms of their capacity over the last few years. They're obviously still in administration, so yes, certainly the environment to rescue that operator as it stands at that size seems tough enough already. But it's
not going to make it any easier.
Yeah, and with Air Italy, obviously, a lot of their troubles perhaps came partly from having that Qatar as their investor, which meant obviously we all know that Air Italy kind of became the centre of a kind of reignited Gulf spat over the fact that the three big US operators, Delta, United and American, felt that Qatar Airways was using Air Italy's proxy Fifth Freedom flights into the US, and that meant kind of Air Italy lacked friends in its efforts to kind of transatlantically and everywhere really. I mean, it struggled, and by the end its network was kind of heavily skewed towards Africa. Obviously a developing market but not the market it originally targeted, transatlantic.
Exactly. And that was perhaps underscored by, we saw within a couple of weeks of the decision to liquidate Air Italy, that Qatar Airways announced the restoration of its code-share with American Airlines. It was just specific comments about what had cleared the air, but it seems very likely that had taken out a kind of major obstacle there.
And on Italy, I think, what will be interesting if Italy turns out to be the country and did have some of the worst impacts of coronavirus, as you say, what's a tempting market again may emerge from this with some what look like big holes for operators to fill, particularly as you say, if the Alitalia situation kind of worsens as a result of this, and what can be salvaged from that is smaller as a result. It may be that obviously Ryanair and EasyJet have already got quite a strong hold on some of those markets, get even stronger, but it may be that someone else is again tempted to have another go. But a lot of ifs and buts really around that. But again, Italy, as ever, I think will be an even more fascinating market as a result of what's playing out there, and it had played out just before the virus kind of took hold. So.
And Air Italy was a magnet for many stories, and one of those was also a customer for the MAX, Boeing 737 MAX. And after the break, we are going to talk to Jon Hemmerdinger from our US office about Boeing's continued efforts to try and get that aircraft back in the sky.
All of our airline business cover interviews are available to read online. If you haven't already, just set up a free account on FlightGlobal.com.
So this March marks a year since the grounding of the Boeing 737 MAX. Down the line, I've got Jon Hemmerdinger, FlightGlobal's North American editor. Jon, the past 12 months, I guess that's been a pretty quiet period for you?
Yeah, you could say that.
Not much going on.
Not much happening here. The 737 MAX has been the story of the year, and it has been the leading headlines. Well, until the last few months, it's been absolutely leading headlines for the last 12 months. And the last aircraft crashed on 10 March last year, and then the grounding took effect 3 days later.
I mean, that story in itself, the whole grounding process, I mean, it feels almost like a lifetime ago, but I mean, that's had such a knock-on effect, hasn't it?
Yeah, and the grounding initially started in China, but the rest of the world reacted within just a couple of days, and that put on the ground about 340 737 MAX, and then, of course, Boeing continued production for about, I'm thinking it was about 9, maybe actually more like 7 or 8 months after that. So the number of grounded aircraft has done nothing but increase.
Which is extraordinary. And all the while, I don't think anyone in the industry was quite ready for and it is pretty unprecedented for how long, it would take for the aircraft to return.
Yeah, Boeing initially made it sound like it was going to return very quickly. They said they had a fix that was ready for the MCAS system, and then it just continually got pushed further and further back as more issues with the aircraft came up, and as concerns about the certification process arose, and as the U.S. Congress and even other federal authorities started to get involved in investigating the internal workings of Boeing and the internal workings of the FAA, which was responsible for certificating the aircraft.
And I guess really there's sort of been a change of pace or a change of approach from Boeing since the leadership and since the change in leadership and the turn of the year. How has Boeing's approach changed, or how is Boeing dealing with the issue now?
Yeah, that's a great topic to touch on, because former CEO Dennis Muhlenberg was in charge until the very end of late last year, and he received a lot of criticism for being sort of tight-lipped, for not being particularly open, and also for setting goals for when the aircraft would be back in service, goals that Boeing never achieved. And towards the end of last year, FAA Administrator Steve Dixon publicly chastised Boeing for those goals, and even sort of accused Boeing of trying to push through the process before the FAA was ready. Anyways, David Calhoun, a longtime board member, took over on 13 January for Dennis Muhlenberg, and he immediately held an hour-long conference call with reporters, and he got on TV, CNBC, and he's been all over speaking about the process, and he earned a lot of praise from observers for that openness. It was a change of tone. At the same time, he said earlier this year that the 737 MAX now would likely enter service in the middle of 2020. So instead of saying it'll be 2 weeks or it'll be a month, he gave the company a full 6 months, which seemed to really please the regulator and seem more realistic to people who are watching the whole process.
So I guess that is the question on everyone's lips, a much easier question to ask and to pose than to answer. What's the sort of thinking in terms of how soon the aircraft could be back in service? Yeah,
Boeing is still, even as of yesterday, saying that they expect a mid-2020 return to service certification. And from what I can tell, they seem to be mostly on track. There are several outstanding issues. One involved wiring bundles, and there was concern that those bundles could cause sparks. That issue was unrelated to the MCAS software, but it's one of those things that came up as a result of the extreme focus on the MAX and sort of the entire review of the certification. Now, that issue is expected to get dealt with. We don't have any updates on where that stands. The other issue that needs to be worked through is how the world's regulators are going to certificate the aircraft, and if they're going to do it together, whether some regulators are going to require different requirements or different dates. There was a report, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, that Canada is considering making changes to the flight manual that would require, it actually would address non-normal procedures. These are the procedures pilots use to respond when something like the MCAS system activates. Now, whether Canada will go that route or whether the FAA will eventually align itself with what Canada wants to do remains unknown. But there is some risk that the return to service could be sort of staggered and different among different countries. So that's being worked through right now. We don't know how that's going to end up also, but generally it's thought that these things are getting processed at least somewhat on a timeline similar to what Boeing is suggesting.
And finally, just from the airline customers, the MAX customers who had the aircraft, and it's a long time to be without those aircraft.
Yeah.
I suppose it's been a different response to me from each carriers, but how's it sort of impacted the airline customers?
Well, it initially had a huge impact, and we were in a time of record growing air travel demand, both in the U.S. and carriers really around the globe, and carriers in Asia that had huge orders of these aircraft, and carriers in Central and South America. These are airlines like Copa and Gol that rely entirely on the 737. Then you have Southwest in the U.S. and you have American and United. So all these airlines were sort of desperate to get the aircraft in the skies, and they were reworking their schedules to try to deal with not having the aircraft, and the planes were packed as would be expected, the existing planes in the fleet. But things have changed over the last 2 weeks as a result of the coronavirus. Now, it may just be temporary, and the coronavirus has taken over as the top story, the top aviation story right now. But United Airlines yesterday announced that it was reducing its domestic capacity 10%. Well, that's a lot of capacity for an airline like United. So it begs the question, would United need 737 MAX right now if the aircraft was returned to service and certificated? We just don't know. We don't know how long the coronavirus impact is going to last. It's generally thought it will be short term, but the effects are real and significant right now. So that throws another question over when airlines are going to take the 737 MAXs. And once the airline returns to service, once the aircraft returns to service, will airlines want them? Will they try to defer deliveries? How will that play out?
Yeah, absolutely. It's as you say, there are a number of airlines for which it temporarily not having the MAX is not a disaster.
It's somewhat ironic because for the last year, or roughly 12 months, I suppose, before coronavirus hit, airlines were clamoring for the aircraft, and Boeing couldn't get it in their hands. And now pretty soon Boeing's going to be wanting to get these aircraft off its books and into the hands of the airlines. And if things are in a few months as they are right now, the picture may be changed for Boeing.
This story is going to run and run. Jon, thanks for your time on this.
My pleasure.
And I would absolutely point people, Jon's written a really great analysis, which is on FlightGlobal.com, which you can find, which talks about the change in leadership and the change of approach in Boeing, and talks about several of the issues there. So I point people in that direction. Thank you very much, Jon.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So that's all for this time. You can find links to the stories we've referenced, including analysis of the challenges facing the Italian market, in the podcast notes. And you can keep up to date with all the latest on how airlines are responding to the coronavirus at the new look flightglobal.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review. We're going to be probably doing a few more of these a bit more regularly, possible pop-up podcasts as we got the opportunity, especially as with such a fast developing news agenda. So don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you get the episodes into your inbox automatically. And we'll see you next time.